This is the Rational Reminder Podcast, a weekly reality check on sensible investing and financial decision-making for Canadians. We are hosted by me, Benjamin Felix, and Cameron Passmore. So today we were joined by someone that I would be surprised if the listeners of our podcast don't know who he is, but it was Preet Banerjee.
Yeah, so I've known Preet for well over a decade because he was an advisor and we're both in the dimensional pool, 10, 12 years ago, I would guess. So I've known him a long time, and he was one of the earlier podcasters. Not even podcast, but he had a blog that he had out a long time ago that has since been shut down.
Yeah, he was on social media early in the game for the financial services industry anyway.
You might actually recognize his voice too, and his face, since we have a video for this. But if you're listening on the podcast, he was often on CBC The National with Peter Mansbridge every Thursday night.
Yeah, he's got an interesting career. He described his career choices as the shiny ball strategy. So it sounds like he chased things that he found interesting over time, but he's done a reality TV show. He's been on The National, like you mentioned. He does consulting and speaking now. Very, very interesting guy.
He's an author. He wrote the book, Stop Overthinking Your Money.
Yeah.
He's got a YouTube channel with almost 90,000 subscribers, I believe. He's a pretty eclectic guy.
Yeah. But one of the big, great to have him on the podcast to talk about whatever, but he's doing a DBA right now, and I chatted with him on the phone a few months ago about the research that he's doing, and that really made me want to get him on the podcast. But he's looking at, I can't remember the terminology he used to describe it. Do you remember the exact words?
Yeah, quantifying the value of financial advice. That is...
Across different channels, though.
That's right, a multi-channel approach.
Yeah. It's fascinating research.
Fascinating, and like I said to him at the end, you're the perfect guy to be doing this. Based on your experience and background. He's also got his undergrad in neuroscience. Really, really impressive guy.
Unbiased, separate enough from the industry that you wouldn't expect him to have a real incentive to say people need advice or not.
So I think it was a great episode, great interview.
Yep, that's it. We'll let you listen.
All right, Preet, welcome to the Rational Reminder Podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, guys.
Super excited to have you live in studio here. Known you for a long time. So you're in the process of completing a DBA and you are quantifying the value of financial advice. You have to tell us more about what you're up to. What is that?
Yeah, well, it all really comes down to trying to answer the question of what is the value of financial advice. And it takes many different forms. So I think the working title of my research is quantifying the value of financial advice across delivery channels. So everything from do-it-yourself investors. So, doing it yourself is a channel of advice. You're getting advice from some kind of online portal with, buy and sell recommendations, all the way up to full service, which can be there's quite a variation in the services offered at the full service level. Some people focus exclusively on portfolio management. Others are more focused on wealth management and financial planning. And so it's a tough question. It's a lot more nuanced than people think. But if you take a look at the personal finance blogosphere and podcasts and newspaper columns, people are very polarized. They're either hate advisors or they use them and they love them. And it's so much more nuanced than that.
How did you decide to take this path of doing the DBA?
Well, it was actually my supervisor who recruited me. So I had met him through some common volunteer work that we had done at the University of Toronto. I should say it was volunteer work on my part. He's a professor there. And one day he just sort of said, hey, you should really pursue a DBA and use this to define the next phase of your career. That's kind of the purpose of that type of program. It's kind of like a professional doctorate. It's different than a pure academic theoretical doctorate where you're taking comprehensives in addition to your research. It's really more focused for people who tend to be professionals already and want to do doctoral level research. And again, one of the reasons that they pursue that is to define the next phase of their career, which is like 10, 20 years. And so he said, with your background in the financial services, you should think about a research question that will really define you as a thought leader, hopefully, with one particular area. And it seemed like a natural fit that studying the value of advice would be a good fit for me because this is something that I've been involved with and vocal about since the beginning of my career in the financial services.
So how do you describe your history in the business leading up to this? Not necessarily the full biography, but What part of your background brought you to this decision?
Oh, that's a good question. I've never had a 5-year plan. This actual program is my first 5-year plan, I think, that I've ever actually had. I've always sort of followed the shiny ball philosophy of career management. It served me well. I mean, I started my undergrad was in neuroscience. I went into auto racing and then ended up in finance.
So it's an obvious progression.
Yeah, totally linear, right? And it was always just a matter of looking at things that sparked my curiosity and my interest, and I just sort of took the leap. Even the stuff that I've done on TV, like hosting a reality lifestyle TV show. I mean, this was never part of any grand plan. It was just sort of, well, that looks like something fun. Maybe I'll do that for a little while. I think maybe the genesis of it was my own blog, which I started when I was a financial advisor. And I got to learn from the opinions of a lot of readers who are very smart, who are outside the industry, and helped give me a different perspective than being inside the bubble and having the industry perspective. And so being challenged like that was something that I really sort of latched onto and enjoyed, and it always stuck with me. And so as I spent more and more time in the industry and more time with this professor, he kind of inspired me to take a more empirical look into answering this question.
So can we talk a little bit more about the research that you've actually been doing?
Sure, yeah. So I'm in year 5 of a 5-year program, but I think it's going to take 6.
Okay.
If my supervisor is listening, I'll do my best. So I'm just about to start analyzing the latest data that we've collected. But what I can tell you so far is we've already run a couple of pilot studies, and it's becoming more and more clear what the outcome is likely to be. But we can't say for sure until we take a look at the actual big data collection that we did.
Can you speculate?
Yeah, absolutely. Probably best to speculate by explaining the sort of the research design.
Love it.
If you take a look at the academic world when looking at the value of financial advisors, like I'm talking like the top A-level journals, like the Journal of Finance, there's a huge body of knowledge that is very portfolio centric. So they'll look at things like, well, what's the alpha generated by these advisors? What are the sharp, like they look at everything in terms of the portfolio. So does a financial advisor diversify people more than they would on their own and so forth? So that's great. So there's a lot of information on portfolio management, but the contemporary financial advice industry has been undergoing this ongoing evolution. So, 100 years ago, it was just about the buying and selling of stocks. May 1st, 1975 was May Day, so you were probably too young to remember that. But that was the deregulation of commissions by the SEC in the US. And before then, commissions were fixed. And after that, this spawned the growth of discount brokerages. And everyone thought this is the end of financial advisors because now people can just do it themselves. And that didn't really happen, right? It's taken a long time, and the market share of people using DIY services, it's significant, but it's not overwhelming. And so the advice industry, they evolved from the buying and selling of securities to portfolio management at the time. And now the latest transition has been to comprehensive wealth management and taking a look at things outside of the portfolio. So if you take a look at the practitioner journals from inside the industry, they're saying, hey, listen, you should really look at us in the context of all the services that we now offer. And so there's this divide, there's this gap between the academic body of knowledge and the practitioner body of knowledge. And both sides have kind of identified that, yes, there is this gap. So there needs to be more research focused on measuring the value of what advisors do today versus just portfolio management. So that was kind of the genesis of the idea. And in order to do that, you would have to come up with a way of measuring how people are doing on other aspects of their wealth outside of portfolios. And so we kicked around a lot of ideas about how to measure this. And what we found was you needed some kind of model that was dynamically sensitive as well as being multifactorial. So as an example, the multiple factors would be not just portfolio, but things like disability insurance coverage. So this is an important part of a wealth management plan. Life insurance coverage, people's savings rate, their portfolio costs, their estate planning completeness. These are all factors of people's wealth management. But each of those factors, how important they are in someone's overall financial well-being, is dynamically sensitive. So the best example that I use is think about disability insurance coverage. If you're 64 years old and everything else has been going along well, you've been saving up for retirement, you've got some assets, and you don't have disability insurance, it's not the end of the world if you were to become disabled. You're effectively self-insured at that point. So the importance of your disability coverage when you're 64, in that particular case, would be very low. If you're 24 years old and you had no disability insurance coverage and no assets, then the importance of your disability coverage is very significant. And so for that factor, you would have to weight it more significantly for someone who has yet to earn a lot of income, and weight it much more smaller for someone who is very close to retirement and has a lot of assets. So each factor is going to have its own sensitivity loading. For portfolio costs, it's not related to age, it's related to portfolio size. Because you could be 60 and starting to save for the first time. And if you had an MER of 3% and you're just starting from zero and putting in, $100 a month,
Right.
Doesn't matter much.
It's a couple bucks, right? But if you're 25 and you inherited $10 million, 3% MER would be borderline criminal, right?
Yeah.
So each of these factors has its own sensitivity loading. And then, the idea would be then you could go to anyone, you could say, so controlling for where you are in your financial journey, your score is, say, 40, if you wanted to normalize it out 100, for example. And you go to someone else and say, well, your score is 70. So it would be independent. You couldn't just look at someone and say, well, you should have a score of whatever. You'd be able to say, based on people like you, here's your number. And then what you would ideally like to do, what I would ideally like to do is a diff and diff study. So that is measuring the difference in that number, depending on the different type of advice channel that you go to.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Right? So this would be a great way to get more into causality, because we've all seen the studies that say the more money you have, it's because you have an advisor, when it's really just a correlation. Because by the nature of the way the industry has been set up, advisors are incentivized to go after people with a lot of money. Hence, that's why people with a lot of money have advisors, because that's who's targeted.
But not necessarily causality there.
No, that's just pure correlation. Right? Without saying anything more. If you just say that people with advisors have more money,
Right.
That's just a correlation. What you want to figure out is, well, who is responsible for how people are doing? And so that diff and diff study is one way to get at causality. Another angle that we're looking at is using what's called a regression discontinuity design. And what this is, I'll use an example that was explained by another one of my profs at U of T. You remember a couple of years ago, maybe it was 10 or 15 years ago at this point, but there was this wave of shareholder votes on say-on-pay legislation as to whether or not shareholders could vote on executive pay and if they wanted to put limits on it or not. And so all these companies decided to put these votes to their shareholders to say, do you think that we should institute say-on executive pay? And so if you take a distribution of those votes, you get a normal distribution. And ideally, what you want to do is you'd say, all right, well, now we want to study the impact of say-on-pay legislation. Is there a difference in shareholder performance for companies that instituted versus ones that didn't? But that may not be a great analysis, because if you take a look at, say, companies in the tails, where the shareholders voted pretty much 100% to enact it, and you had other companies where the shareholder vote was close to zero, there might be something else that's also really different about those companies if they're in the tails. They could be so different that it's some other factor that would impact the share price. So what this researcher did was he took this discontinuity and he basically said, well, take a look at the top of the normal distribution. So the 50% mark. If you were a 50% plus one vote, you enacted the say-on-pay. And if you're 49.9, you didn't. And there's probably something more similar about companies that are close together at that discontinuity than the ones that are in the tails, right? So essentially what you do is it's kind of like those votes could have gone either way. They were so close to 50. So it's kind of like they were randomly assigned into a treatment or control group. And so by taking a look at the companies that were close to that discontinuity, you could probably say, all right, now we have a little bit more confidence in saying that the difference in shareholder price was because of this intervention, which in this case would be the say-on-pay or not. So all that to say is we built into the survey some questions that would capture the propensity to delegate to a financial advisor or not, because there would be something really different about someone who is 100%, I'm going to do everything myself, versus someone who says, you know what, I have no interest in whatsoever, I'm just going to delegate.
Right.
They're so different in probably so many other ways that you can't just say, well, the people who really want to do it themselves but somehow used an advisor.
But how do you quantify the advice for someone that's in a DIY channel? Just the advice of the source of where they're doing their trades?
It's sort of the outcome measures their financial well-being, right? So you want to see if someone does it themselves and goes through.
How well are they doing themselves?
How well are they doing themselves across all those different factors, right?
Wow.
Not just portfolio, but are they actually getting an estate plan? Do they have the right amount of life insurance? Here's the thing. When we talk about investments and do-it-yourself, they're kind of synonymous, right? People think about managing their portfolios, buying and selling stocks as being DIY. There's lots of literature out there. There's a lot of great books out there. There's a lot of personal finance blogs. There's a lot of podcasts talking about investing and managing portfolios. Have you ever heard of an insurance podcast or an estate planning pod? Like, they're few and far between, and they're geared towards industry participants,
right,
not the public. And so someone who might be in the DIY channel, maybe they have a great portfolio and maybe not. And there's a huge variation. But let's say the ones that do have a great portfolio, maybe they just fall apart on all the other factors of wealth, which tells you that the value that they're getting from that channel is sort of concentrated on one factor. So these are the sort of questions that we're asking. And the questions that sort of gets at the propensity of people to delegate. What we would be looking at is people who are on the fence. They could have gone either way, and take a look, well, of those people who are very much on the fence, but used an advisor, and those who didn't, or used some kind of hybrid channel versus full service, what were the difference in their outcomes? So there's so much to unpack, and designing it took a long time.
So can you speak to any of that data? Like for the advice channel, has anything jumped out at you, or for DIY, has anything jumped out?
I mean, referring to the pilot study, because I haven't analyzed the data on the full collection that we did, the final data collection, but looking at the pilot studies, there was some really interesting things that popped up. Right before I sent out some of the first pilot studies, I threw in some questions at the last minute, just because based on my intuition of working with people and talking to people, I wanted to see was there an effect. And one of those questions had to do with their childhood and how financially secure their childhood was that they grew up in. And there was an inverse relationship between the financial security of the household that they grew up in and how well they did as an adult making financial choices.
Wow.
So the more insecure the household was that you grew up in, the better decisions you made later on. And presumably that was based on, talking to people saying that those things stick with you and you never want to replicate that. You have to kind of like hit rock bottom before you get motivated to do things. Same with like losing weight, right? Everyone waits till January when you can't see your toes anymore. They hit rock bottom, then they get motivated to do things. And so that was kind of the corollary there. The other one was financial communication. So the more open the household was that people grew up in, the better the financial choices they made later on in life were. If the advisor provided financial planning, had a big impact. So that was statistically significant in the pilot studies. And it showed that the financial well-being of those people were higher than those who were using financial advisors that didn't provide financial planning, but just execution. Man, there's so much more I could unpack. What do you want to know specifically?
I'm curious about, did you measure for quality of advice?
So it's tough to measure for quality of advice. Like, how would you measure for that specifically? You'd have to get a lot of data and sort of see, well, what are the things that people are getting implemented? So some of the questions we asked were, what did you have before you started with your primary channel of advice? And what did they implement during that time? Things like life insurance, estate planning recommendations, disability coverage, getting people to save more money. So we asked people questions such as, who was responsible for deciding how much you saved into your savings over time? And here's a great example. Let's see if I can remember the numbers. If you had someone saving, $200 per month into a high interest savings account for 10 years, earning like 1.5%, you have like 26 grand at the end of that time period. If you are only saving half that amount, but wanted the same ending value of around 26,000, you need a rate of return of like 14%.
Right.
So what was really important was the contribution rate, not the MER, not the rate of return necessarily. It was the contribution rate. And so figuring out how much people put into their portfolios was really important. And this is one area where I think that, robo-advisors and DIY services may not be a great fit for everyone because they presume that you know how much you need to save. And there's not really going to be the same amount of push that a really good financial advisor who's like modifying people's behavior to say, no. $200 a month is not enough. You actually need like $600 to hit your goal. And if you don't have someone there who's really pushing you to do that, maybe you might see some projection that says, oh, you're off target. But you'll say, well, I can only find another $50 because you're not going to push yourself as hard as maybe a good advisor would.
Really interesting. So that intuitively makes sense, but I don't know if you're speaking to the actual data, like from the pilot study. Did that show up?
So in the pilot data, we didn't ask those questions. Those are in the final data survey that we put out. And that was all informed from kind of the holes that we found in the pilot study. So we had 2 pilot studies, and part of the reasons for the pilot studies were as a proof of concept as, is this going to give us enough data and things to look at for us to sort of answer these questions? And so there's a lot of things that ended up in the final survey that weren't in the pilot studies. And so I haven't analyzed that data yet.
I'm on the edge of my seat. Come on.
Yes, so is my supervisor.
I've got so building that model, that in itself is a big undertaking. Like building a model to score someone's financial well-being, you have to do a lot of thinking about like what you said, what factors impact someone's finances depending on the stage that they're at. So I'm curious to know, in building that model out, was there anything that you realized or figured out that surprised you?
Well, one of the challenges that we ran into was in one of the earlier pilot studies that the questions were too complex. And so one of the things that we did to validate the survey was we sent out the survey to a handful of people and then interviewed a few select people to ask them about their answers specifically. So I wanted to know, when you answer this question, what did you think the question meant? And I asked them about their answer and went into it a little bit more deeply. And what I found was there are a lot of people who didn't know how to answer the questions that we asked in the early pilot studies. They were too complex. And this is one of the challenges. The level of financial literacy is pretty low. The output, the analysis is only as good as the inputs, right? So if we don't get good inputs, then the analysis is garbage. And so we actually had to adjust the questions so that they would be less granular. So we lose some resolution, I guess, in order to get data that we knew was more accurate of people's actual situations. Because if they're answering questions and they're actually misinterpreting the questions, then that would be of very little use.
So you've been a student of the industry for a long time. I'm curious if you're learning things already that you know that if you put them into the industry now, they'd have a huge impact.
Yeah. Some of the other things that we're looking at is when you take a look at product costs. Product costs there's a lot of pressure there. There's margin compression. The growth of indexing has driven down active product costs as well. The access to information, the sharing of information has opened up a lot of people's eyes. And so you've seen price pressure on the product side. On the advice side, it hasn't had the same amount of pressure as you would have expected. So if you take a look at, say, a typical robo-advisor model, they give you a portfolio of relatively low-cost products. Some of them are passively managed. Most of them are actively managed. And then they have advice costs on top of that. And a lot of people say, yes, this is a lot cheaper than, a traditional human financial advisor. But if you start picking apart all the different components of wealth management, you're actually saying, well, maybe it's 50 basis points that they're tacking on top of the product cost for asset allocation and execution. And so that's, the traditional human advice cost might be 1%. And so for that extra 50 basis points, a really good advisor is doing a lot more than just asset allocation. So the calculus changes. If you sort of do a blunt comparison, maybe a robo-advisor is half the cost of a human advisor. But if they're only increasing people's score on the portfolio management, maybe a little bit on retirement planning, and a full service advisor, twice the cost, but they're moving people's score across 8 different factors.
Really interesting.
They could actually move the overall score by 3 or 4 times versus some of these other channels. And so if something is twice the cost but delivers 4 times the change in this score, people have a different way of interpreting, what is actually worth it.
So is there too much focus, you think, on fees and less on the value of the advice? Is that kind of where this might take you?
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, I am looking at what is the value of advice. And one of the things that makes it so tough to study is that there's no standard model of advice, even across these different channels. If you take a look at, just bluntly, a human financial advisor, you have some who are, nothing more than salespeople. You have some who are doing comprehensive, unbelievable financial planning, and you've got everything in between, right? And just because you're at one channel at one firm and you have 2 people with CFPs, one of them might be providing financial planning, one might not. So just having the designation alone does not mean that you're getting financial planning. And so you have to tease all this out. And you guys probably saw a couple of years ago, there was that mystery shopping exercise where the OSC and CSA went to, I think, 108 different shops, as they call them. There were 88 valid visits. And out of those 88 valid visits, there were 48 different financial advisor titles used. So there's such a huge differentiation in the types of service and the service portfolios that are offered out there that it's really tough to sort of say at the end of the research, well, if you just go to this company and this channel, you'll be fine. You can't say that. What we can say is you should be looking for advisors who are doing X, Y, Z. And it's a lot of stuff outside of the portfolio management.
So that's one question that I want to try and touch on is of all of the different things that you looked at in the model, is there anything that jumps out at you as being exceptionally important? For example, is there something that DIY people are generally not doing, but would be an easy fix that they could be doing?
Yeah, everything outside of the portfolio.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so far, it looks like they focus a lot on managing their portfolios, but they don't spend a lot of time on all the other stuff.
Fascinating.
And that could be a real problem. They can have this perfect portfolio recipe that, for the next 40 years, if they don't become disabled, if no one dies, they don't lose a job, everything's great. That's a lot of ifs, right?
Yeah.
And so between now and the time horizon for their portfolio, if they don't mitigate some of those risks, that could be a real problem. Maybe they're not saving enough money into their perfect portfolio strategy. So maybe they're leaving some wealth on the table and they could have retired earlier or what have you.
So insurance saving, is there anything else that falls into those categories of what people could be doing better?
Well, I mean the behavior modification, of the rates of return that people are actually getting versus what their investments are getting. So I'm sure you guys have talked about a lot the difference between the rates of return that are available in different investment products versus what the investor actually gets.
Yep.
I'm sure you've got Carl Richards. Oh yeah, there you go.
Right there on the wall.
Yeah, there you go. So.
That was good on your research. And now I want to jump into the next thing that I wanted to talk to you about, or we wanted to talk to you about, which is the MoneyGaps project
right.
that you're working on.
Yeah, so this was born out of the research directly. So a while ago, I was giving a series of presentations on my research to about 2,000 financial advisors across the country. So I was talking to them about, the research design and some of the things that we're seeing, and I showed them, here are some potential ways to commercialize these findings that would apply to the financial services. And so I threw up these shoot from the hip sort of, dashboards of the things that you could do. You give people a score on their estate planning, you give people a score on their life insurance and disability insurance and all this stuff. They were all like salivating when I was showing them this. And I thought, okay, after every presentation, everyone has expressed a desire in this. I should just go out and commercialize it. So that was the birth of MoneyGaps. And MoneyGaps is designed as a hybrid advisor platform. And the way this is different from a robo-advisor platform is robo-advisors all started with a B2C model first. They all said, all right, we're going to cut out the financial advisor and just give people access to turnkey portfolio management. I think they're starting to realize that is a very tough nut to crack. If you take a look at the percentage of people who are actually choosing to go to a robo-advisor, even though there's a lot of great marketing out there, it's probably less than people would have expected by now. And so I think what they're realizing, at least in Canada and other jurisdictions around the world, that if they offered those slick tools and interfaces to advisors to use with clients, then that could be another source of revenue. And so they've all turned to sort of creating these pro versions, right?
Right.
Which are their tools available through human advisors who go out there and actually hunt and prospect and all that stuff. And so they were B2C first and they pivoted B2B. MoneyGaps is designed B2B first. So it does a lot of things different. I actually hired an innovation lab to run some design sprints to figure out all the pain points from both the advisor perspective and the client perspective to figure out what are the things that should be addressed by any new type of product or service in the market. And what we found was for the advisors, the top pain points were finding clients to begin with. Compliance was a big one. And then just the financial planning software out there was too onerous to invest in if you wanted to target people who didn't have a lot of money. So what that means is that unless you have a lot of money, you're probably not going to get some really robust financial planning. There are some exceptions, of course, but for the most part, the really high-end financial planning is reserved for high net worth households. And so there's this gap in the market where the mass market, the more numerous average person out there is not getting any type of real financial planning. So at least there's a shortfall in that area.
So this could become a platform to make it affordable to deliver advice to the average Canadian who may not have a lot of assets?
Yeah, and that's what we've decided to do is we're creating basically a financial planning light model.
So it's an interactive model between the client and an online experience of some sort? Like how do you make it more efficient?
So it's really quick to produce a basic financial plan that tells you if you're headed in the right direction. So take the time that would be required for a full-blown financial plan and take about 10% of that time. And what MoneyGaps does is it produces a report card system. So you get an overall GPA and you get a grade for every category, life insurance, disability, your investments, education savings, etc., and the overall GPA, so that people can say, if you're in your 30s or 40s, you don't have a lot of money, but you do want to at some point, be in control of your money and amass some wealth. You want to make sure that you're headed in the right direction. So we analyze debt loads and everything. So it gives people a sense of, am I doing okay relative to other people like me? And what I think it can do is we can actually start to see some price movement in the advice side of the costs. So where we're seeing compression on the product side, we really haven't seen that on the advice component. And I think MoneyGaps can allow for a high volume financial planning experience, which allow advisors to say, either I'm going to have a high volume model, or for advisors who are dealing with higher net worth households, but have like these thresholds of, 250 or 500,000. Now you can say, well, listen, I can offer you a light version. If you have assets under 250, we go through this process. And then once you get past that threshold or somewhere near there, then we can do the whole shebang. So I think it will help open up the market for financial planning to the mass market. That's where I see MoneyGaps operating.
Interesting. So it's really it sounds to me like an automated course correction. Like you input some information and it tells you where you're falling short. Yeah. It tells the advisor where the client is falling short.
Yeah, it does. It also automates a lot of things for advisors on the compliance side. So on the insurance side of things, there are regulatory requirements that have changed where you have to deliver what's called a reasons why letter for any recommendations that you make. So because you have to enter in the inputs into MoneyGaps to get a score and then a list of recommendations that the advisor chooses from, the advisor chooses those recommendations and everything gets pre-populated into this reasons why letter.
Oh, interesting.
And what we decided was, because that makes a lot of sense in terms of accountability and transparency, we actually adopted that process for every type of advice they give, whether or not it's life insurance or not. So even if it's a savings recommendation for their portfolio or something about managing their debt, they get a letter that says in plain English, here are the things that you need to do. Because one of the things that we found from talking to advisors is, it takes a long time to learn the really sophisticated financial planning software. And when you produce these 10, 20-page reports, clients don't read them. And they couldn't tell you what's in there, a couple of weeks afterwards. An advisor would spend another 15, 20 minutes creating a one-page synopsis of what does this all say? Right. And that's the only thing anyone ever looks at. So I'm going to just go straight to that.
Do you foresee a day where the gaps really do start shrinking?
The gaps for?
Financial plan, this gap between where people are now and where they should be. Do you see that gap shrinking through tools like this and other awareness?
I think so, yeah. And I think what's really interesting going forward is seeing how the next generation of financial consumer, how those gaps would be addressed for them. Because it looks like they want, technology-assisted ways of doing that helps them do it without even thinking about it. Like, think about all the apps that are out there that round up the difference in their spending and put it into some kind of investment. They'll probably start to see stuff like that on the insurance side and other aspects. We're starting to see a lot of online estate planning tools out there like legalwills.ca and Willful, and there's a new one that just launched as well. So these are all starting to sprout up as well. And I think that a combination, depending on the type of financial services consumer out there, some people are going to have more hands-on advice. Some people are going to have more hands-off advice in the terms of technology. So that's what I was talking to you earlier about, how it's not black and white. There's like this whole spectrum, and that includes not only the type of advice out there, but the type of consumer out there and what they want. And it's not black and white. You can't say everyone should have a robo and everyone should have a human advisor. There's a huge spectrum.
So do you think the value of a human advisor is highly dependent on each individual consumer?
Yes. I don't know if I would say highly, but I think there's definitely a correlation. I don't know how big that correlation is. Right now, I don't have any hard numbers to back this up, but I'm going to say about 90% of financial consumers need intervention of some sort outside what they would be able to do on their own. And I know that there are probably a lot of people who are saying, what are you talking about? I can manage my own portfolio. That's great. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about everything. I'm talking about not just the portfolio, but all the other stuff out there as well. Because there are a lot of people, no doubt about it, who can manage their portfolio just fine. But I'm not concerned about them so much, at least with respect to portfolio management.
You can buy VGrow now, right? You can buy VGrow or XGrow, and that's it.
Yeah, exactly. But there's so much more to financial advice than just investments and portfolio. That's the thing.
So that kind of dovetails in with one of the last questions I wanted to ask is, what do you've done all this work, all this research on the different advice channels, talking to people, all these different things, and then you've got this software that's going to help human advisors give advice where do you see the core benefit of the role of the human advisor?
There's a couple. I think for the vast majority of people, it's going to be a combination of, yes, there's going to be advice or value on the portfolio side, setting up people's portfolios, because there's still a lot of people with horrific portfolios. I mean, just because you do it yourself doesn't mean you know what you're doing, right? You know how to transact on an online discount brokerage account. That doesn't mean your portfolio is going to be great, right? So there's still going to be value in portfolio management, no doubt about it. But that portfolio management solution is commoditized. So an advisor, they can spend time trying to tweak people's portfolios, but I don't think there's a lot of payoff there in terms of their time, because that's kind of been solved, right? It's the getting people to do things, the behavior modification, getting them to save more money, getting them to get the appropriate amount of insurance, getting them to actually complete their wills and powers of attorney. A friend of mine, Mark Goodfield, who runs the Blunt Bean Counter blog, it's something like 75% of people either don't have a will or their wills are out of date. And this goes across the gamut. It's not just low-income households who think that they don't need estate planning that don't have it. It's very high income families that don't have estate plans in order or severely out of date. So I think the behavior management is a big factor, and then the comprehensive wealth management. So what I often tell people, lately, is that financial advisors who think they're in the portfolio management business anymore are wrong. Right. They're in the people management business and the wealth management of those people, because the portfolio stuff has been figured out and you can apply that. And they spend so much time on that when really it should be on the other stuff, where I think they add value.
So how do you think, I know one of the things that's come up a lot recently or more recently is you've got the robo advisors now, but you've also got the fee only, I'll pay you $500 for a conversation about my finances. Yeah. How do you think that fits into the model that we were just talking about? Can you get the same kind of value from that as you would with a traditional AUM-based advisor? I
think you can, but again, this sort of speaks to how different consumers want and need different things. So there are some people who will probably say, I'm good with that because they've got a laser-like focus on minimizing cost. And for some people, it'll work, and for some people, it won't. So one of the things that could be a potential barrier is if you're so focused on just reducing costs, like the reason you're doing that is to reduce cost, you go and you create a financial plan and then you don't go back for 5 or 10 years. That could be detrimental to your potential because things change. Like there's no financial plan out there that once it's created is good for 40 years. That does not happen. Right. It very soon starts to get out of date. And the longer you go, the more stale it becomes because life happens, things change. For some people, I think it's a great solution. I think there are a lot of people who can manage portfolios if told what to do. I think there are a lot of people who can go out and execute their life insurance if they're told what they need. And so I think there's a huge market for that. So I think in terms of the growth of that type of advice channel, I think there's a lot of room for growth. Right. Because as a share of the market, it's still very, very low. Yeah. And it's also painful to write a check. And so there's that mental barrier as well for people of writing out a check. But again, to sort of put a button on that, there are all these different types of advice models out there and all these different types of financial consumers. And it's a real trick to align the right consumer with the right channel.
Interesting.
So my last question for you, I think, having known you for a long time, I think you're the absolute perfect guy at the right time to answer or to try to answer the question of the value of financial advice. So I applaud you for what you're doing.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
And I'd like to know, on this mission, how will you define success?
Oh, that's a great question. I think long-term, what I would like to see is more people getting access to financial planning. And if the research informs some people out there to say, hey, you know what? We now have some metrics that we can use to replace some of these old metrics because these were the only metrics we had available to us, which was production levels, assets under management. And when you have a different framework, you can say, if we want to incentivize financial planning, now we can, because we can create a way to measure how much financial planning is actually being done. And so I think one day you're going to start to see, salaried advisors providing high volume, light financial planning experiences to a lot of people. So 65% of people do not have financial plans. And I even think that number is a bit low. I think a lot of people don't even know if they have a financial plan. they might think, oh, I have a projection for my retirement coverage. And they might think that that's a financial plan, and it's not. So I think the vast majority of people do not have a financial plan. And so I think a good measure of success is if we move the needle on the percentage of people who do have some kind of financial plan. It's not just reserved for people with a lot of money. Everyone deserves to have a financial plan. Even if they're just fresh out of school, you can have a plan for that. Maybe you don't need to figure out retirement just yet, but maybe you need like a 5-year or a 10-year financial plan or something like that. So more financial planning made more accessible to more Canadians, I think, would be an outcome that I'd be proud of.
All right, last question. Bigger picture. Forget about the research. For you yourself, how do you define success in your own life?
Getting back to only working 2 days a week.
Okay.
For a while, there's a bit of a history behind that, but a long time ago, I was about 12 years ago, I became ill to the point where I actually thought I was going to die. And that had a great way of changing my perspective on what was important in life. And I started to really value spare time and taking a nap in the middle of the day and just enjoying the smaller comforts in life. I would say no to a lot of opportunities. And as I started to get a little bit better, I started to say yes to more opportunities. I found myself getting a lot busier lately, especially doing this research and consulting work that I do. So now the needle has sort of swung a little bit too far in the other direction. So I'd like to get back to, 2 or 3 days of work per week, and then I'll be happy.
What do you do in the other days?
Like work days?
When you're not working? You want to work
when I'm
2
not
days
working?
a week?
Just relax, travel a lot. One of my favorite things to do is that, when it's sunny outside, just having the freedom and the flexibility to, well, not anymore because my motorcycle was stolen, but to hop on my motorcycle and go for a nice ride and find a coffee shop way out in the middle of nowhere and just sort of watch the world go by. Simple things like that, were great. But so more of that.
Cool.
Yeah, it's been great to have you. Thanks for coming by the studio.
Oh, yeah. No, it's my pleasure, guys. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Preet.